All right, I think we'll get started. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or evening, or wherever you are. Um, Welcome to already the 11th field day of the Agriculture Genomes to Phenomes Initiative. My name is Jack Dekkers. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Animal Science at Iowa State University. I'm one of the co-PIs on the project, and I lead the field days. And I also want to acknowledge Nicole Scott, program specialist, who coordinates a lot of the technical organizational details of the field days, along with others who are involved in the organization. And today we are going to talk about precision livestock management in an extensive rangeland system. We've had field days in the past about phenomics and intensive data recording in crops, in greenhouses, or in the field, and we've also had field days on animals in confined systems. But you can imagine that things are going to be very different when you think of a very extensive system like beef cattle or sheep in rangelands, or even dairy cattle on pastures, and all the issues that come with that, to be able to collect the type of phenotypes that we need if we want to be successful in AG2PI. So today we have two excellent speakers to introduce us to that topic and tell us about what they have been able to set up, and the issues that they have run into, and solutions and remaining questions. And so Dr. Hector Menendez and Dr. Jameson, or Jamie Brennan, they're both at the Department of Animal Science at South Dakota State University. And they've done a lot of work on rangelands, beef cattle on rangelands, and looking at it from a systems perspective, and utilizing extensive data, or high data recording systems, to high throughput phenotyping, to collect data in those systems. As usual, if you have questions, please put them in the chat, and I'll follow the chat. And if there are questions that pertain immediately to what the speakers are talking about, then I'll interrupt them. But otherwise, there will be breaks both during the presentations as well as at the end, where you can ask questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Hector and Jamie.
Well, Dr. Dekkers and everyone else, it's just an honor for Dr. Brennan and I to be here. Let me just get the correct screen. Can everyone see the full version of the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so this is a photo of the Bad River, which runs through western South Dakota. It's one of my favorites. And so these are the type of systems we're going to be talking about today, extensive rangelands. And we're very excited, like I said, to be here. So just to orient you to where we are, we're in South Dakota. We're west of the Missouri River, and our research was primarily at the historic site. It's a 100+ year research station, the Cottonwood Field Station, highlighted in red here. And so at this station, one of the novel things is there's been a grazing trial going on for over 80 years, or for about 80 years. And so we get to the privilege to work at this site and utilize these wonderful resources. And it is quite a bit drier, so the precipitation is about half on the western side of the state, just to give you an example. And so just to go over an outline, and again, as Dr. Dekkers said, feel free to interrupt us. We hope that we can stir the pot a little bit and get some good conversation going. And so we'll go over precision management, livestock management, extensive systems, where we're moving towards in terms of what is precision grazing, and an overview of precision measurement technologies, the role of models, and then precision management technologies. And then end with kind of this workforce development and kind of broader implications of the practicalities of these technologies within extensive livestock systems. And so precision livestock management, essentially, we can go back over this, but it's the use of technologies and models to enhance livestock production, increase individual animal productivity. And so we want to increase that efficiency, optimize our resources, natural or store-bought inputs, for example. And then we're really moving from a herd or pen level to an individual animal level in terms of management. And so here's Dr. Brennan on the left, and we're installing the vents system out on the range. And then there's the collars on the right that we have put on steers this past summer. And so with precision technology, you've all heard of these tools, 21st century tools. We're all familiar with Rancher and an iPhone or iPod or whatever, some tablets, getting data. But really, the way we want to look at it in a systems view is, we have this management and there's some type of performance. So are we meeting animal, environmental, whatever performance goals are within our system? And so this is also interpreted by farmer experience. And as we talk about these technologies, we never want to discount farmer culture and farmer experience in terms of interpreting performance, and that dictates management. But now we're in this new world of, and let me minimize this real quick, sorry, of real-time data. And so with sensors, we're able to feed the farmer experience or his insight with real-time data. But we're going to leverage models, because unfortunately we can't all sit down in Excel for hours and hours, or Python or R. We need models to leverage this real-time data to inform our management, to enhance the system performance. And so, just going over this quickly, precision livestock management, there's a lot of examples of collars, robotic milking, feeders, smart tags, cameras, deep learning. And so these have had tremendous advances for dairy and feedlot systems, but little has been done for extensive rangeland systems. And so now we'd like, Nicole, if you'd please launch poll 1. Okay, so I see that it's up, and we'll just give everybody a minute to fill out this poll. Okay, yeah, thanks, Jamie.
You're about stalled out there.
Yep. Okay, I'm gonna share the results. And so I think you should be able to see them, and most people put thousands of acres and then hundreds of acres for the bottom one. And so I'm gonna stop sharing this. And then, okay, we should be back here. Now, we launched this poll for a couple of reasons before we bias you with our thoughts on extensive. I'm sure you've seen pictures like this with smart farms or precision livestock, PLF, precision livestock farming. And so there's not a lot that mentions scale. And so this is really good for a system with infrastructure, but we kind of want to expand into what does this mean to have Wi-Fi and sensors within an extensive rangeland? And Dr. Brennan's going to tell you all about that.
Well, thank you, Hector. And so, as Hector mentioned, you typically have this image of here's a farm. This is an example out of Texas, kind of near where Hector grew up, where you have a lot of sensors that are interconnected on that farm, and they're all sending data back to a centralized location, like a house or a ranch headquarters that has access to an internet out there. And so, looking at that 230 acres for not an atypical farm in this part of the country, let's kind of look at that at scale. You're probably looking at about a half mile to a little bit over almost a mile across from one end to the other. Not very long distances, fairly flat country where you're trying to get these signals out and send this data to be able to upload it to the cloud. You also notice a lot of houses, roads, infrastructure that are out there as well. And so if you look in the upper left corner, that's that same farm in Texas, kind of to scale for what we're kind of dealing with at our Cottonwood Field Station out here in western South Dakota. And so on this picture of the landscape, you're looking at approximately 3,700 acres. You're about 2.5 miles from one end to the other. on that landscape. So a much bigger landscape that we're talking about out there. You know, not really much for infrastructure. There's a ranch headquarters up at the top, but you really don't see anything else in terms of houses, roads, things like that. And so it's just a different, bigger landscape that we're looking at. Now let's take that a step further, and now we're looking at, for example, like a Forest Service allotment here in eastern Wyoming. And so you might be at about 30,000 acres on this landscape. Again, those previous two are to scale up in that left corner, but you're about 7 miles from one end to the other. There's a lot of topography that you can see in this image. And really this poses a lot of unique challenges when you're trying to implement sensor technology on landscapes like this, where essentially you have big lands, lots of elevation changes, very little to no obvious infrastructure that's available out there as well. And so kind of the point we're trying to drive home here is just kind of this understanding of what we're talking about in terms of extensive systems. These are kind of vast rangelands here in the Western United States primarily that tend to operate livestock production on a fairly large scale. And so, for example, you know, the U.S. Forest Service leases approximately 91 million acres of grazing allotments or leases within the Western United States. Within South Dakota, it's kind of on that eastern boundary, you might be at an average allotment size of 4,700 acres. Get out there to Arizona where you have forage that's much more dispersed, lower productivity out in those areas. You might have an allotment size on average of 20,000 acres. And just because that's the average, there might be ones, for example, in Nevada where it's 100, 150,000 acres. And it's not atypical in some of these management scenarios where you might just dump your cattle in a fairly large allotment and come back 5, 6 months later at the end of the grazing season and hope you could gather all of them up. And so they're really difficult challenges if you're trying to bring precision management to these systems that are operating on these landscapes. And so one of the big challenges when we talk about precision management are these communication limitations. And really, I think what's kind of held back some incorporating precision livestock management into extensive rangelands is trying to overcome some of these communication limitations that we've always had in these areas where you don't have internet, you don't have access to cell service potentially. And so for data to be useful for managers or producers, you really need that real-time access data for them to be able to make management decisions on that. And so to be able to have that real-time access, you need to have connectivity to internet. So all your sensors that are out there that are deployed on animals or in the field are able to send that information to the cloud or what have you, so you get access on your phone or tablet or computer. And so the big challenge of extensive rangeland systems, limited cell communication. You can see here, comparison there is based on square miles, coverage not available everywhere. We know if we go out here in some of these ranches, you know, you might have one bar at best or no service in a lot of these areas in Western South Dakota. And the more kind of rural you get, the more this is the case. And so there are a number of technologies that are out there to kind of wirelessly communicate data. And so one is Bluetooth technology. And so you can have your sensors out there that are able to send data back to a Bluetooth reader or some kind of device that's deployed in the field. And so benefits of Bluetooth, one, it's low power. Some of your older version technology, you might have a range of about 100 meters. Newer Bluetooth, you might be looking at about 400 meters in range. And so if you look at our example here at our Copperwood Field Station, that red dot is located at a waterer. And so if you look at about 400 meters around that waterer, you get an idea of how much coverage you're going to have to be able to collect data from sensors. And so if these things are located on animals, they need to come within that radius to be able to get that information off those. And so if you're going to deploy this on a larger scale, you can imagine you probably need a lot of these devices that are out there to be able to read that data. And then those devices also need to be connected to the internet so you can upload that internet data to the cloud. And so there are some examples of using Bluetooth technology. One is ice cube pedometers that are primarily used in dairy, and they're used to detect motion of animals and been used for diagnosing health issues and changes in behavior. Similarly, Herd Dog is a company that makes smart ear tags that you can put in animals as well. And they have a device called a dog bone that reads the smart ear tag information. Again, that needs to be connected to the internet to go to the cloud. And you need to be somewhat strategic when you're placing these out there on the rangelands to be able to put them in places where the animals are going to be nearby and congregate to be able to actually get that information out the ear tag. Now, a lot of examples when we talk about precision ag use things like LoRa communication. So LoRa-enabled sensors that are deployed in a field that are able to transmit data. And so LoRa communication sends information via low-frequency radios communication. And the big advantage of LoRa in a lot of situations is it tends to be low-powered data transmission. And so that really increases your battery life. And so if you have sensors that are either located on animals or in remote areas where I always have access to them, you're able to send data for long ranges, potentially 10 miles, using fairly low power. And you can see there, that dot is that Bluetooth range in the middle, and that red line around there is kind of that 10-mile radius around our research station. It gives you an idea of how much further you're able to send that data if you have good line of sight. And again, when it sends this data, that tends to go back to a central gateway that also requires connection to the internet or cell service. And really, when we talk about communication, there's a lot of other communication styles out there or technologies. And really what this is just balancing power, bandwidth, or the amount of data that you're able to transfer, as well as range and how far you're able to send and transfer that data out there as well. And so really, if we're implementing precision technology, we need to consider these three things primarily to be able to balance what our needs are for agriculture. Now, there are a lot of technologies that are coming down that we're kind of starting to overcome a lot of these limitations that we've had on extensive systems. And so one of which is called edge computing. And so in a traditional sense, you might have sensors that are deployed out in the field. They're then relaying all that data up to the cloud. And then on the cloud, on the back end at some remote data center, it's then analyzing all that data and delivering visualizations, delivering management recommendations to producers out there. That's kind of all these algorithms that are working on the back end on that. Now, when we talk about edge computing, the data is actually processed on site or at the source. And so in this example, you can imagine these soil moisture probes might be in there recording data every 15 minutes. Maybe there's an algorithm that says if soil moisture gets below a certain level, that's when it's going to send a signal up there. And so it's really minimizing that amount of data transfer that you have to send to the cloud and really just sending up more of a packaged data. And so an example, some of the research done out here at our Cottonwood station is using high frequency accelerometers to be able to monitor livestock behavior. And so a lot of these ear tags, these motion sensors are powered by accelerometers. The ones we use will record data about 12 hertz per second, or which comes out to about 12 records per second. And so if you look over a course of a day, you might generate about 1 million data points per cow or steer per day. That's a lot of information if you're trying to get that raw data out, and you just physically can't be blasting data at 12 records per second up to the cloud. It just takes too much bandwidth. And so you could develop things like decision trees or random forest algorithms, and you could take that raw data, process it, and turn it into, say, every 5 minutes, you might export just one data point: grazing, resting, walking, etc., upload that on a chip. And so now, instead of sending 1 million data points to be able to process it on the back end, you could now just send 288 points per day. And so really just reducing that amount of data that you're sending out. And so again, we're overcoming a lot of these communication limitations. One is reducing the amount of data you get out, but we're also increasing things like our cell coverage. And so here's our cell coverage map. Big thing I want to point out is 5G is the latest technology for cellular. We really don't need 5G coverage though in a lot of our applications to be able to get information out. And so access to 3G, 4G, what have you, is filling in a lot of these gaps in the West where previously you didn't have cell coverage. In addition, there's advances in internet service. So Elon Musk, for example, is beta testing his Starlink satellite internet, and I've known a few people that have actually purchased one of these and are implementing these. And really, this is a series of satellites that are launched in Earth's orbit that are essentially going to bring internet access to the entire globe. And so you might be even in the most rural areas of Nevada and still be able to put one of these out there and get internet access. In addition, there's a couple of startup companies that are working on LoRa-enabled satellites. And so these are satellites that are going to be deployed that your sensors that are located out in your field, out on your animal, et cetera, are actually able to communicate directly with these LoRa satellites. These satellites can then send that information to the cloud. And so we're kind of on this cusp of technology and communication technology right now, where we might be in 5 years have global connectivity. And so even if you're in the most rural parts of Africa, for example, you can still have connectivity to the cloud, be able to send information out and be able to make management decisions off of that.
Yeah, before we go any further, I think this is kind of a natural stopping point. I see something in the chat. I'm just gonna try to look at that really quick. Okay, it's just a hello message. So yeah, again, feel free to put something in the Q&A or the chat, and if you have a question, feel free to interrupt us.
Yeah.
But now we're
Yeah,
gonna.
So actually, I have a question. So with the edge computing, I can see the need for that, but would you still want to store the raw data at the source and then, you know, download it? You know, once you gather up the cattle, you could retrieve the sensor and download it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it somewhat depends on the user of that product. So if you're, you know, obviously from a researcher standpoint, you want all the data, right? Be able to look at all that data, see how well your models are performing. But maybe on an application where you're deploying that on a producer's ranch, you know, they might not be as interested in collecting all that raw data. They might just want those, you know, process points that are coming out that you could then make a management decision on.
Yeah. So I'm assuming there are lots of limitations on how much data you can store at the source, but that's improving all the time also, right?
Correct. Yeah. I mean, we were just talking about buying a micro SD card for a camera, which we're now at, you know, it's about this big, less than a centimeter big, and 250 gigabytes. And so always, yeah, memory is becoming cheaper and smaller. So you have the potential to be able to store more information on site. It's really the challenge is getting that information out and how much bandwidth that takes.
Yeah. There's a question from Jennifer Clark. How do you do data quality filtering at the edge prior to something like RF?
Yeah, I think we're going to touch on that a little bit later when we talk about data quality and building in algorithms. So if you could hang on, I guess, a little bit, Hector's going to touch on that.
So let me, and we'll touch on this too, but I think another thing with this research versus application is just the battery life. And so how often are you going to want to go pull these sensors off? And so that accompanies the data, pumping out the data. But yeah, we will touch on that exact question from Jennifer later on in the presentation, if that's okay to postpone it.
Yeah, that's fine. Great.
Okay, should we keep going or any more comments?
Yeah, please.
Okay, great comments and questions. Appreciate those. So yeah, we kind of gone over, okay, all these communication challenges, and now we're switching into kind of some physical challenges. So conventional nutrient capture for like feeding, confined feeding is, you know, there's a crop, it's going to be harvested by a combine, for example, and stored at a certain nutrient quality, though that can vary within storage and preparation, and then fed out to the animals in a formulated diet and a TMR. And so what's different about range is just that the cattle have to go out through the landscape and capture the nutrients on these extensive landscapes. So I don't think the cattle are walking across this far. This is the largest 30,000 acre allotment, but just for example, they're moving across this area, gathering nutrients, selecting based on preference or different things, location. And so in addition to going out there, they also have to return to watering points. So there's a big energetic cost. I've left this kind of energetic and nutrient details out, but I think we can all understand that, just walking back and forth requires energy. And so the other challenges that increase that energy use is topography. So a lot of these have big hill slopes that the animals have to move up and down and back and forth to be able to capture these nutrients from our rangeland grasses. This includes the diversity and resources distributed throughout these landscapes, including mineral composition. Furthermore, seasonality affects, it's not only where they are, but when they are. So are cool seasons present, are warm seasons present, and those grazing interactions and climates and different things continually adjust the quality and availability of our forages for livestock. Additionally, there's things like environmental challenges. So not only is the animal moving from areas maybe low crude protein, low palatability, high TDN, but they're exposed on these systems to wind, rain, the sun. And so although we're in South Dakota, it can still get quite hot in the western portion. So we recorded temperatures up to 107 degrees Fahrenheit, and it can get as low as -40. And that's not even including the wind chill factors of what it feels like when it's, it's quite windy here as well. And so just want to stress those environmental challenges. And so now we've talked about these challenges, but how are we going to overcome them? And we really believe that precision technologies can help us do that. And so we've categorized this into two main things, is precision measurement devices, which Dr. Brennan will go over next, and then precision management. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Jamie.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. And so a lot of the work when we talk about precision measurements on rangeland systems, there's been a tremendous amount of work actually in remote sensing. And so when you think about remote sensing, it's gathering information off of a physical object where you're not actually in contact with that object. And so typically when we talk about remote sensing in rangelands, we mean using things like satellite imagery, drones, for example, to be able to image the earth and make inferences. And so some of the good examples are looking at monitoring plant communities remotely through time. So the rangeland analysis platform, you could look at things like herbaceous forb cover, herbaceous grass cover, shrub cover throughout the western United States over the past 40 years of the Landsat program. Some of the work also we're looking at here at Cottonwood is using things like big data analytics to be able to predict that forage quantity and quality in real time to inform our management. And so we're going to be leveraging things like, here is your real-time climate data compared to your historical climate data, your satellite imagery, real and historic, and pulling in all this big data and information from these cloud computing sources, be able to build algorithms to make predictions of how much forage we have out there available for our animals, as well as kind of the quality of that forage that we have out there as well. Another technology that's been around for a while in livestock management is use of GPS tracking to be able to monitor kind of livestock distribution on the landscape, what areas are using or underutilizing. And these are combined with accelerometers as well and movement metrics to be able to actually get at individual animal behavior out there. And so you can look at things like daily grazing time and maybe start parsing out that here are animals that are grazing, 2 hours more than some other animals, and they maybe aren't as efficient in utilizing their resources out there as some others. In addition, you can kind of start getting at individual animal grazing selection and how that relates to landscape features. And so here's one of our pastures, and all these green dots are actually graze locations for GPS collars on our animals. You can see in that lower right corner is this big concentration. It's almost like a line that's drawn across that pasture where animals are really focusing their grazing. And that was actually a fire that burned previous in that fall. So they're really concentrated in their grazing and getting that kind of fresh green grass that's growing on that burned patch out there, probably the highest quality forage. In addition, some technologies, things like smart scales. These are scales that you can put in front of your existing water systems that have an RFID tag reader on them. So every time your animal goes to step up to take a drink, it'll read that tag. It'll record a front end weight of that animal. And then some of our work has looked at correlating that front end weight to that full body weight of that animal as well. And so really the benefit of these is typically in range studies, you might get a weight at the beginning of summer when you put your animals out on trial, and you might get a weight at the end of summer when you take them off, but you really have no concept of what's going on in between there. You just kind of have 2 data points at the beginning and end of summer. And so really it's just increasing that precision of being able to collect data on these animals and then infer what's happening, the changes as you're moving through time. And so you can look at things like herd averages, how is your herd performing as you're moving through time, as well as individual performances. And so you can see there that blue animal line, blue slope line, that animal is gaining about 1.9 pounds per day. Look at that red line, they're gaining about 1.4 pounds per day. What are some of these behavior, genotypical, what have you, factors that are contributing to these differences in animals' behavior? You can also look at differences in management things like stocking rate on our pastures, or our Hector referenced earlier, a long-term grazing study that we have at our station using light, moderate, or heavy graze systems. And you could look at, detect changes in animal performance through time, and that could also inform your management decisions. And so, for example, our ranch manager gave me a call. We're in drought out here in western South Dakota this past year, and it's extremely hot this summer. And she was concerned some of her animals in her heavy graze pasture looked like they were shrunk up. She was kind of concerned about the health and well-being of them, whether there was enough forage. And so we could actually then pull that data in real time and look at that animal performance and say, hey, well, actually they're gaining pretty good out there, and not just on a herd level, but actually look at the individual animal level, and then continually monitor that to see if you see changes that are occurring out there. So that's just kind of one example where you have, a management concern. You can then look at real-time data to be able to make an informed decision, and then continue monitoring that as you're moving through time.
All right, so one other technology we feel is really important to mention is just measuring enteric emissions, since there's so much pressure on the animal science, especially beef production, for greenhouse gas and climate change. And so green feed, for example, is an alternative to respiration chambers. If you've ever used respiration chambers, you know how bulky and difficult they can be, although pretty much the gold standard. And so we can use these to evaluate the energetic efficiency. Two key metrics is methane and carbon dioxide emissions. And what's really encouraging, we'll deploy 2 of these next year. They're being built right now. And so McGinn et al. Found that there's a 1% difference to the chambers, respiration chambers, if you're using it for short term. And so this is just perfect for our rangeland applications to be able to monitor enteric emissions in these rangeland cattle throughout the growing season. And so now that we've covered the suite of land measurements, like remote sensing and animal measurement tools like the smart scales, we're going to go through this 5-step process of, okay, we're able to collect the data, but now what's the next logical step? And so we want to quantify the difference of actual and expected metrics. So just to give you a quick rundown, we all have, whether it's performance, animal performance, environmental performance, you name it, you have where you want to be, your desired, and you have your actual. And so, we can do this, and it works both ways, but there can be a deficit in forage availability, nutrient quality, crude protein, average daily gain. And so these can be performance shortfalls. And so unfortunately, with Mother Nature and the way grass grows, are different animal classes. There's differences between calves, weaned calves, cows, heifers, and bulls, and the phases that they're in. And so that doesn't always align with the nutrients that are available in the landscape. And so these technologies can enable us to more quickly identify performance shortfalls. And at the same time, we don't want to overfeed animals. If we do have to supplement, do we want to supplement everybody, or can we actually be wise, or maybe not wise, but more efficient at adjusting stocking rates or limiting supplementation so that we're not in excess in feeding cows that may, or animals that do not need those excess nutrients. And so now that we've identified, okay, there are clear performance gaps and everybody has them where you are, where you want to be, we're going to switch into modeling, or decision support tools, decision support systems. We're talking about mathematical modeling here to really leverage computing power with this data. And so within our systems that we're working, typically you have a continuous grazing system. It's the beginning of the season. You're going to make a management plan. Maybe you have an allotment, so you work with the NRCS or the Parks and Forest Service, and you release these animals for the season, and then you collect them, as Jamie described. And then we have this next step, which is rotational grazing, where there's this management where they're moving through this series of paddocks that are hard fenced or poly-wired. And so that takes a little bit more labor, but it's balancing out that rotation. And so then we're moving to precision management, where now we have data on individual animals, and we can dynamically address these pastures based on different factors that are changing throughout the growing season. So let's talk about some of those. So precision technology connected with mathematical models. So we're getting this smart scale data. And so a lot of the NASEM or beef NRC requirements are driven by body weight. And so a lot of you have probably estimated body weight, but now this component is being filled in real time or near real time. It's a game changer, not just an estimation. And so this provides a critical information feedback loop for us. And so what this means is that, let's say we set that initial pre-grazing season plan, but now we can get those adjustments in body weight, nutrient requirements, energy requirements, and we can adjust our animal unit months and dynamically adjust these pastures using these models and this data. So further on model use, there's a big component. We mentioned the real-time data. There's data repositories from things like AgCross or national repositories, libraries, coefficients. And so these can be leveraged through APIs to inform our models, and when coupled with this real-time data. And so now we have this ability to link open source or R and Python models, for example, that can feed this information and help inform our decisions. And so again, accounting for this real-time feedback, just one example is the ruminant nutrition system, more for confined operations, but we're hoping to do something analogous in terms of RNS range within these works. And so, and this will touch on the question, Jennifer, that you mentioned, other model use and considerations. So data size, these models can be used embedded or streamed to output one data point to that data point of interest to inform management. And so this falls into this optimization or even predictive analytics, which we're going to talk about next, to not just have a reactive decision, but actually begin forecasting and management ahead of the time based on this other real-time data like climate. And so with this evaluation of real-time data, how do we know the data is good? You can see there in red, data quality. Well, first we have to collect some sample of data and have some, averages and standard deviations to be able to say, okay, this is normal. And our models actually have to have the range to be able to detect those changes. So that's important for our sensors, is that capability of detecting whether they're errors or not, these wide ranges of metrics that are coming in. And so one idea to maintain data quality, overcome gaps in data, is things like the model evaluation system, where we can very easily check things for accuracy and precision, R-square, mean bias, Thiel's inequality statistics, and these potentially, and we hope to embed them within these algorithms or within these edge computing devices once we know what those parameter bounds are. And so I'm going to pause here in case there's any other considerations or questions, since this was a question from Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. And Jennifer has another question. Are these predictive tools open source, or are they proprietary?
Jennifer, are you referring to ones that we've mentioned or in general?
Yeah, sorry. More sort of in general, because like you're talking about this modeling stuff, which is great. And then the question is, okay, as researchers like you, if you identify an issue, like there's a data gap or the model's giving you results that are not, kind of make you puzzle and shake your head, do you have the ability to then go inside and kind of see what's going on? Or are these tools really proprietary, and so you don't know exactly what the algorithm is underneath? And I just don't know in general. I don't know this area, so I don't know whether it's sort of expected that, yeah, these are open source and you should be able to go tinker around, or are these really proprietary? And so ranchers are kind of, okay, you have to work with the company that's offering the tool and try to work with them in figuring out what's going on underneath the hood.
Right, that's a really great question. Thank you for asking it. So the model, those type of models, proprietary and open source exist. Let me tell you what's going on right now from USDA and from industry, and then what we're planning on doing, and some other research that's happening. So surely there's models like the CNCPS for all dairy models. 70% of dairies use CNCPS through Cornell, and that's proprietary. And so then you have, let's see, like the USDA, where a lot of things are written in Fortran. So, and don't get me wrong, we're just going to the next step. So I value like Arnold or Al Roth's, their work, but a lot of it's in Fortran. And so it's been one person who's done a lot of hard work, but this code's in Fortran and has to be reformatted. And so, for example, SWAT's done a good job of taking the EPIC models and translating them into a really well-documented model. So being a modeler and talking to modelers across the country, different modeling teams, the new generation is saying, okay, great, this is really valuable work. Let's translate this into Python and open source. If it is legal and, you know, through the federal government, surely we can do that and not make it, not monetize it. And so now where we're at is modelers not only have to understand the animal science, but develop, and what we're doing is developing open source code that surely, you know, we're going to publish it, but it's going to be, everything under the hood is going to be there. The code will be available, will be open source, it'll be documented. And so this will create this, this opportunity for not only to see what's going on or fix bugs, but for the code to continue to evolve with the latest like Python or R open source programming language that are going to be maintained and sustainable as we progress forward. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. And that's where a lot of times we have the challenge of what the producers need and what the researchers are interested in, right? So there's this kind of collaboration where you want to support ease of use for the producers and ranchers, because they want to push the buttons, and so they like the nice GUI and they want to see the outputs. But then, you know, when you're working with them, you want to see what's kind of under the hood, and you want to be able to implement the coolest, newest stuff. But that's not very WYSIWYG, right? So there's kind of this, and then I like the point that you made about the sustainability of the tools. Being someone who used Fortran many, many years ago, it's like, yeah, it's great, but it's, you know, you have to be an expert in coding to really know what's going on. And so there's this spectrum of the tools out there, you know, what's easier to modify, but then also what's easier to use. And so I appreciate the different perspectives that you want to use the latest, greatest, but in terms of actual use in production systems, they want what's reliable and robust and what everybody accepts. And that, you know, so there's that adoption piece that's in there that you alluded to.
Sure. And that, oh, sorry, James, yeah.
Oh, no, I was going to say, you hit on a good point there. And one of the things I wanted to highlight is there are differences, whether you're talking about, you know, researchers or even us, you know, we tend to be people that really push open source code, open source material, even open source hardware and technology. So, you know, universities that are maybe developing open source tools. There's also companies like C-Lock we've referenced before that actually are really good at just giving you all the raw data that are coming off of their devices that you could then start building in quality checks and releasing open source. And I won't say other companies, but you know, there's other precision companies that are out there that are much more proprietary about their technology. And so if you ask about it, they'll tell you, oh, we use, you know, AI to power it, but they won't kind of give you anything that's working under the hood in terms of how accurate are their AI models, you know, what are false positives, false negatives, stuff like that are happening. And so there's kind of a spectrum out there between researchers at universities as well as, you know, companies that are developing these technologies. And it can be difficult sometimes to get 100%, at least for me, 100% behind a product if I don't exactly know what's going on under the hood, or have some kind of published paper where I could say how accurate some of these algorithms are.
Yeah. No, that's great. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's not only knowing what's under the hood, but I think there's also protection of the raw data by some of the companies that develop the technology, because they want to develop new management decision support systems based on that. And I know that's a big issue in the dairy cattle industry, but probably the same in the beef cattle industry. Yeah, that reminds me that if you have a question, put it in the chat, but also feel free to just speak up during these breaks, during these discussion sessions.
Yes.
Anybody else have anything else they want to raise at this point? Okay, if not, then we'll turn it back over to you, Hector and Jamie.
Okay, thanks. So 3 kind of recap points, or maybe new points. One, Dr. Decker's data security, that's like what's keeping me up at night right now to figure that out. And so that's probably going to be, I think, one of the biggest challenges for this open source interface. But either way, I don't think it's not insurmountable. And then the second thing is, I'd like to mention, Jamie developed some really nice R-based Shiny apps, and these have been really successful in our program. And so not only can they go, I'm sure he could show them all the equations that they really wanted on a research level, but it's just this user interface. And so that's also a critical component, like Jennifer was mentioning. They just want the information they want. They're not like us researchers who have all this technical, want to dive into every equation and coefficient. And then the last thing, and I'll just point you to this, Dr. Peter Vados and Kristen Reed have started a template for the ruminant farm system model, which I'm going to talk about later. And they've just set up this pathway for documenting these new models that's really sustainable. And so I would just point you to Dr. Kristen Reed. She's just done a phenomenal job of model documentation, and so the models don't get stuck on a shelf in the future, and are very credible and reliable. But yeah, let's keep moving forward. And so with these model considerations, we talked about like climate. And so there's things like the delayed effects of climate. So not a lot of things, just because it's hot one day, doesn't mean the animal is going to lose performance in terms of like dry matter intake. But cold stress and heat stress are very real things and well documented in the literature for cattle and other livestock production. And so there are various equations that account for adjusted temperature factors affecting dry matter intake and other kind of energy equations. And so an example here, we have this data for the heifers that Jamie was telling you about. And so if we were to take just the beginning and end, we'd never see this dip in performance. And although it's intuitive that we'd say, well, of course, it's -20, right? It was -20 last February. Of course, they're going to, spend more energy on keeping themselves warm and shaking, growing hair for their coat. But we would have missed this if not for the smart scale data. And so this is where we're moving to those predictive analytics of, we have these forecasts. Okay, the cold snap's coming up. This can be fed into models and used to adjust diets to be able to better position our animals to respond to these environmental conditions. So there's just one example that I really appreciate that we collected last season. And so in terms of environmental condition, this sticking with individual animal variation, built a model for the cow-calf, stalker, and feedlot phases for Texas that can be applied to any state. And what you see here from black to blue to green to red is an individual variation for water use based on the nutrition and climate feedbacks for these animals across the supply chain for beef. And so in order to better represent water use or the water footprints, we're installing soil sensors that can be connected to remote monitoring to our data hub that can be used for forecasting grassland productivity and understanding the effects of different management, grazing management, for example, on water conservation and function. And so this is just one more piece of the puzzle to get down to an individual rancher level instead of this high level of aggregation. And so another thing we're doing is installing these smart flow meters that are LoRa enabled. So our center does have a LoRa hub that Dr. Brennan installed. And so this will feed these data for total blue water use. And so there's some very practical things like, is there a leak? You know, that can be a really easy email detection from these programs built into some type of alert system. And then hopefully we eventually aim to drill down to individual drinking water intake, although this is right now in progress. But here's a picture of our Covet water with a new version of the smart scales. And so we hope to, between the tag and the flow meters, at least get a picture, a rough picture of rangeland water use and begin to record this data, since we're in such water limited systems. And so really what I hope to impress upon you is that we want to close the loop. So right now, the models for water use and water footprint use surveys, and they're at a very high level regionally. And they've indicated in those papers, the authors, that we need to drill down to the individual level for managers to actually say, well, what practices can I implement to save water, for example. And so right now we're using equations or general coefficients to estimate this water use, and you can go into things like total blue water use, and they say, okay, I'm high and low. Let me do these management decisions to decrease. But now with these sensors, this outside loop, we can get actual water use or more observed data with this real-time water recording to increase the accuracy and precision of our total blue water use estimates to inform water management on our ranches, on our individual ranches. For a cow-calf producer here who wants to send off a water efficient animal into the stalker backgrounding phase down the supply chain. So there are a lot of additional dynamics. We won't dive too deep into this, but Jamie's mentioned remote sensing. There's handheld NIRS, near infrared reflectance, and then drones. And so all of these can be coupled to capture things like forage data, nutrient cycling, predictive analytics for those things, moisture, composition of different C3, cool and warm season grasses, C3, C4, availability, regrowth, even potential nutritional factors. And so we just believe there's a huge potential to integrate these technologies to, again, inform our models to get some type of informed management decision. And again, I want to impress upon you we can't interpret all this data. As humans, we don't have the cognitive ability to just do it, but models can really just leverage that horsepower of ripping through the data with reliable and well-documented algorithms. And so just to drive home this example, we're improving the accuracy and precision of current models. So there's Teague's model for grazing. And so these are being, instead of historical, now we have this real-time observed or estimated for things like weather, for things like the soil and vegetation dynamics, or even weight gain, as we pointed out. And so there's just tremendous potential to capture better data, more accurate data, but then individual animal data as well for these models and to go forward. And so I mentioned the ruminant farm systems model. And so I have the privilege of being on the committee at Cornell for Rink Takama, who's a PhD student. And she is developing, and this is kind of a sub project, it won't be on the first version of the model, but a grazing model for Rufus. And so what I want to point out here is she's using this model to evaluate things like gains in nitrogen use efficiency, phosphorus cycling, carbon footprint, and then the reductions in costs from high leverage strategies. And so here's just a pictorial of, there's an excretion, nutrient cycling, it goes back to the forages that are going to be consumed by the animal. And so we're, again, capturing this feedback, and sensors can help us do that better. And so one last thing is we really want to capture these management decision rules. And so you can go out there, for example, and say, okay, my grass is 6 inches high, so therefore I'm going to rotate the pasture. And so with sensors and different data, instead of just having these hard rules, we can actually use that to provide us that data to do things like a 3-day rotation and dynamically adjust these paddock sizes throughout with the real conditions, real-time conditions. And so here's just an example of our simulated, and this is in progress, rotation, 21-day rotation or rest period and 3-day rotation that we're working on right now, and hope to eventually inform with real-time data. And so you're saying, great, you showed me, we're checking the data, we're using models to capture all these really important components, but let's slow down here and think about, okay, do we want cheeseburgers or do we want broccoli? And I like both, but cattle have a preference. And so there's things like palatability models that are management tools that Dr. Brennan's going to mention next will help us to say, well, animals, you don't want this, but we're going to manage you in such a way where you eat the broccoli instead of just what you prefer to prevent preferential grazing and things of that nature. So again, there's a really practical aspect. Although the animals are on this landscape, they definitely have a choice of where they want to go and where they want to graze. And so just to recap, we've moved through collecting the data, performance gaps. We've gone over the use of models at a high level. And now we're going to move into, okay, I have this data, I have the information. What do I do with it? I'm going to hand it over to Jamie to talk about that.
Thank you, Hector. And so really, if a lot of this precision management technology, it's really kind of hoping to reduce some of these labor constraints of implementing this on the landscape. And so, for example, if you're going to implement a rotational grazing system, you have to go out there, physically put up either new barbed wire fence or polywire fence, move your animals around in some kind of rotation. There's a lot of planning that goes into that, as well as maintenance of a lot of that infrastructure as well. Or cattle handling, if you want to weigh your cattle in the traditional sense, that you need to bring them in, gather them, run them through a chute to get their weight on them. It's a lot of stress that you're putting on your individual animals. And so by having technology like this out there, you're reducing that stress on your animals, potentially increasing performance on them as well. And so one of the technologies we've implemented at our research station is this virtual fence technology. Virtual fence technology, the potential is that you could fence these rugged or remote landscapes that are out there, areas that maybe in the past aren't practical to put a fence through to be able to rotate your animals around. And potentially also reduce your man hours that you're going to spend physically fixing a fence. And so some of our just off the cuff surveys that we've had with some of our producers out here is, if there's one job that you could automate on a ranch, what would that job be? And a lot of them will tell you, well, it's fixing a fence. It's everybody's least favorite chore. And so you have that potential that this might solve some of the kind of labor constraints of going out there fixing fence by putting in virtual fence technology. And so the system we've used is called Vents. It's a company out of California. And how this works is that you have this base station that's connected via cell signal to the internet, and you could access that with a web application and communicate with your animals, your collars. You place these collars on your animals, and these collars are outfitted with electric probes and sound. And so the animals receive a sound or a shock stimulus when they get near a management zone or a virtual fence boundary. Works kind of similar to a dog collar. And so users are actually able to go into the application, able to draw their fence boundaries wherever they want on the landscape, and then send that to the collar so it knows using GPS technology where it is in relation to that fence boundary, whether you need to implement some kind of stimulus. And so, for example, here's one of our pastures. That red line is our virtual fence boundary. And you can see underneath that is a soil layer. And so going through, you could program your entire summer rotational grazing using this virtual fence technology. And so as you're going through there, you could turn off one fence, be in there for 2 weeks, turn off one fence, open up the next area, and kind of pivot around your water source, moving your animals. And really you could set this up for the whole summer. You're not actually going out there physically moving your animals around on the landscape or putting fence up potentially as well. And so it's fairly effective. Not every technology is 100%, but we found that it's actually fairly effective in being able to control where animals are and their movement on the landscape across some of our pastures. And so their technology, you do have animals occasionally that'll get out, that'll break through that virtual boundary. Once they come back to water, for example, they're essentially recaptured within that. You kind of start that process over for them. And so what this enables you to do is things like real-time tracking of your animals and where they are on the landscape. I don't know if you want to hit play on that.
Yeah. Got it.
The video works. But these are 3 pastures that we have at our station. 2 of them are virtually fenced, and you can just watch it like a lava lamp as they move around on the landscape.
Jamie, while we're looking at this, a question. So what type of stimulus is typically used to keep them in?
So it's an auditory followed by a shock. And so there's a training period of about 3 to 5 days typically to get them used to that. So it'll be, if you kind of get near that red boundary, it'll kind of give you that beep sound on the collar. And then if they keep going, it'll give them a shock similar to what they have if you actually have a polywire fence out there and a fence energizer. And so they will learn over time that, you know, associate that sound with the shock. So the idea is that when they go and hear that sound, it'll turn the animals around and away from that management zone.
Okay, thanks.
And so, you know, other than looking at these pretty movements on the map, which I think are, I don't know, oddly fascinating to me to watch animals move around out there, the really benefit of a lot of this is you're able to get real-time data. So that physical location can tell you things like, from a practical, you know, livestock producer standpoint, do I have an animal out? I could pull up and say, okay, this cow is out here over the neighbor's pasture. I need to go get them. And I could find exactly where they are. You could also look at health metrics. How do you change that? How does that behavior change from one day to the next? Or is your grazing dropping off? Are your animals not necessarily staying with the rest of the herd? Things that can be indicative of sickness. And then also get real-time utilization of your pastures as well. And this can really tie into your grazing management. And so if you have areas that you know where your animals are really concentrating their grazing, you know how much forage is out there, they might be overgrazing certain areas that they prefer where all the cheeseburgers are. You could then dynamically virtually fence out these areas to be able to move animals to areas that are less desirable, that are getting underutilized in your pastures. And so what we see here is really a huge management potential that exists out there for things like this. And when we talk about management potential, it's not just on the kind of animal science side on the individual animal performance, but also management potential for your natural resources as well. And so you have the ability to exclude animals from some of these environmentally sensitive areas. So you have a riparian zone that's running through your pasture. You can then fence that out and minimize the animal impact, improving things like water quality. You can also exclude them from areas that are sensitive for wildlife. And so there's been research that's shown that depending on your timing of grazing, cattle can either improve sage-grouse habitat, nesting habitat, or, you know, have a negative effect on sage-grouse nesting habitat. And so you can adjust these boundaries of where your animals are or are not able to graze to improve things like endangered species habitat. In addition, you can move animals to the highest quality forage. And so if we're connecting things like remote sensing out there, get an idea of where the highest quality forage is on the landscape, can we then move our animals to capture kind of that nutrients out there when they're best available? And so from a practical standpoint, also when we're looking at producers implementing these, you know, there's always a cost of technology and a barrier of economic barrier for getting into some of these. Can some of these producer co-op groups that exist out there share a lot of these systems? And so can they share a LoRa base station to be able to, not just for virtual fence technology, but for a lot of LoRa technology, to be able to, you know, place these strategically on the landscape. And now you're covering an area of 50, 100, 200 square miles, and folks are sharing the cost across that system as well. And then using these, yep.
Sorry, there's a couple of questions that relate to this. So there's a question from Jennifer. How do you make the return on investment argument with producers for these technologies, in particular the smaller producers? And you know, the co-op, I think, is one of the solutions, but you still have to make the argument, right? So how do you make the argument?
Yeah, and that's part of the work that we're looking to do as well, is kind of, and Hector will touch on that in a moment. Everybody's getting ahead of us.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. They're on the right track.
We're anticipating well. But yeah, I think a lot of these new technologies are all great, especially from a research standpoint. We get excited about that. But I think on a practical standpoint, they all need to be evaluated on a return on investment for things like that. And so virtual fence technology, you know, there's costs for these base stations or subscription fees that you have to put in there as well for these. And all that is a cost for producer, and that can be balanced. Sometimes you can look at what is the cost of putting a physical fence in place of that. And so physical fences tend to cost about, you know, $10,000 per mile for a barbed wire fence. And then also co-oping, like I said, some of this technology, instead of one producer buying 3 base stations for the property, maybe 7 or 8 producers that are all going to be within that range share that cost, which is really one of the biggest costs out there.
There's another question related to using the virtual fencing or the vent system. Have you, from Carolyn Fitzsimmons, have you tried vents on cows feeding calves?
Oh, we haven't yet, but we know some producers in the area that have been using virtual fences on cows and calves. I don't think the collars themselves are actually will fit calves. And so you're just gonna have to virtually fence the cows out, which are the ones that are consuming most of your forage or a lot of your forage from the landscape. But yeah, there are, and that's part of the challenge too, is the effectiveness of some of these systems is that draw through those management boundaries. And so if you're in a drought, your forage is limited, you might have more opportunities for those animals to be willing to break through that virtual boundary. Calves might also be one of those things that might draw them away as they're kind of getting in and out. They get in and out of physical fences all the time. You always see calves out.
And I would add that bulls, haven't been shown to respect this technology. They just take the shock and the sound, and then they're done. They're out.
Mm-hmm.
So, hi, this is Scott Flynn. A couple of thoughts around that. Really, it doesn't really bother, I think, most producers if that calf wanders over, away from the fence, and most mama cows will get a long distance away from those calves and hide them. But calves are not really going to start contributing much to at least forage utilization until they're about 3 or 4 months old. And honestly, a lot of the grazing research has been done over the years, what they call forward creep gate grazing, letting the younger animals get into the paddocks ahead of the cow so they can actually get the highest quality forage available is desirable from a weaning weight perspective. So, that's one thing that I see about that. I don't think a lot of producers are going to get that be that concerned about. The other thing is there's a huge return on investment here that hasn't been talked about. And that's in any time you get into a rotational grazing system where you're protecting the residual height and putting animals back on the field in a proper timing, is that a lot of times we will double the amount of forage that we can produce during the year simply because we're protecting that regrowth. And I currently work in a grazing system, and a year and a half into it, we've increased the carrying capacity of the farm by 50%. And the producer, to this point, I mean, it's just a no-brainer for him to look at the investment in rotational grazing and say, yeah, I'm making money on this. So that is a huge return on investment that I haven't heard you guys talk about yet, but there's no doubt that a lot of times we will double the amount of forage that we're producing on these landscapes once we have a good rotational grazing management practice in.
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent point. And another thing we didn't mention also, and it's not there yet, but the NRCS, especially out here in kind of the western states, a lot of their investments, money they put equip programs into are fence and water primarily. And so down the road, there might be potential for NRCS to be able to cost share some of these, to realize, like you said, some of those benefits of rotational grazing and increased forage production.
There's a very practical question from Sandy Smart, and I think this refers to the GPS collars. How long do the batteries in those last?
They're still working on those. For our research needs, we tend to set the collars to record GPS data a lot more frequently. So we want more frequent GPS data. With that higher, GPS is really the big power consumption on these collars. GPS technology just draws a lot of power. Sometimes you notice that if you're keeping your GPS on your phone while you're driving a long distance, it will really kind of drain that battery. And so we'll be at about 4 months, for our grazing season out here. I think the company says for regular producer using them, it'll probably be about 9 or 10 months that they'll be able to get a battery life out of the collar before you got to replace it. I know that's something they're continually working on improving.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so just wanted to mention one thing about that comment. I really appreciate that, the gentleman before Sandy. And one of the challenges that we really need to address, so definitely those regrowth dynamics, and we're trying to quantify that within our rangeland sites. but providing producers with that explicit data and economic data is one of our aims. And so, for example, Augustine published a paper for AMP grazing that showed the economic benefits and of adaptive multi-paddock versus continuous. And so I think it depends on where you are, and definitely an advocate for rotational, but as much of that data that we can document of that hard return on investment and the time it takes to get that return on investment from rotational grazing, for example, is just super critical. So thanks again for bringing that up.
So related to the question on batteries, Pat Schnabel suggesting to put solar panels on the backs of animals.
Yeah, and there is another company, and I don't know that they've launched yet, that's making them out of Australia, and they actually do have solar panels on the collars that are able to kind of charge those batteries. I see Sandy mentioned movement, and I know there is kind of some engineering technology where you could transfer that motion into energy back into the batteries as well.
Yeah, kinetic power.
Yeah, and I think all that is probably stuff I would imagine would be coming down the pipe in the future as well.
Yeah. Okay, great.
And then I'm just going to say it quick: livestock crop integration. There's potential, huge potential for that as well. Where and it's also a challenge sometimes with a lot of crop systems, crop fields, that you don't always have the best barbed wire fence around those. There's also a lot of potential to bring in livestock to be able to graze crops or cover crops without having to improve a lot of that physical infrastructure around those fields. Another precision management technology are precision feeders. So these are devices where you can put your supplement or your feed or total mixed rations within these and target your supplementation to animals. So one of the big challenges on supplementing animals, especially on rangelands or any system for that matter, is that you have a huge amount of variability in your intake. And so some animals, if you put them out there in the feeder, might overconsume 150, 200% intake of your supplement. Other animals might underconsume and maybe only get 5 or 10% of what you're putting out there for them. And so in some animals that are over consuming, that essentially just turns into nitrogen waste, for example, that they're just urinating out. Other animals might not be performing to where they need to be or where we need them to be because they're just getting out competed for some of these things. And so these things have these technologies have the ability to target your supplement to the actual individual animal. And so really you're moving that management from that individual, from that herd level down to that individual as well. So really what we see this direction going, we've kind of talked about precision measurement technologies and precision management technologies. It's really the integration of these technologies across the board. And so a project we're starting this fall is looking to integrate these smart scale technologies with these precision supplementation ones. And so typically if you're supplementing an animal, a heifer, for example, developing her on rangelands, you might want to target her weight to 60% of a mature cow weight at time of breeding. And so let's say, for example, you're recording your weights early on in the season, your target weight is 840 pounds at time of breeding. We could then project out of what she's going to weigh at that time based on her rate of gain, and maybe she'll be at 990 pounds over. And so we could dynamically then adjust that supplementation level to reduce that average daily gain. So you could, one, have more of your animals arrive at that target weight at the exact same time, have a more even batch of heifers, but also you're reducing that waste for some animals maybe that are consuming more nutrients than you need, or other ones that aren't consuming enough that you need to kind of get them to catch up. And when we talk about limitation implementation, there's also just a lot of practical considerations to think about too when we put these on extensive systems. You know, one of which is climate or exposure to the elements. You know, things like -20, -40 degree days. It's kind of hard sometimes to generate enough solar power to be able to battery power some of these devices. You could also have animals like mice will get in there and chew up all of your wires, as we had over the past year. And then again, that kind of gets back to the data quality. Can you then program algorithms to be able to detect when that poor data is coming in and be able to identify and fix these issues when they occur? Animals need to use the devices correctly. We talked about these collars, and they're able to administer an electric shock. Those two barbs, if that collar gets twisted around, those two electrical probes are sticking out. they'll keep on shocking. The animal's not going to feel any stimulus. It's not really going to care about that sound or that shock that's occurring there. So animals need to be able to step on scales, use collars correctly. Really practical barriers sometimes to implementation on these systems. You don't always have control over everything. There's also delays in communication. You know, when we talk about real-time data, how real time is it? You know, if I send my management to my base station, and then that base station then needs to send that, you know, virtual fence to all these collars that are in their pasture, there's delays that occur in that communication life. And that also are things that need to be considered.
Right, and so we're just gonna kind of touch on some, which everybody's done a great job of mentioning, the return. And so, you know, speaking with producers in Western South Dakota, they just said, well, Hector, at the end of the day, what's my wallet gonna look like? And is a producer gonna buy a $90,000 grain feed unit to measure enteric emissions? Yeah, probably not right now, but every day technology is coming down more and more. And so one of the critical things that we're documenting is labor time, the value proposition of the technologies, and how long it's going to take to achieve a return on investment with things like net present value, return on investment, and net income, and reduction in costs. And so these are just critical components that we're including in our research to provide producers with that production differences, investment costs, and the lifespan of these technologies. And we can't forget about the maintenance of these technologies. And so, yeah, we're just, again, that's a critical part. Another aspect is, okay, great, you invested in this technology. How long does it take to learn how to use the technology? There's a producer learning curve to where using vents or smart scales, using them effectively and efficiently. And so we feel as more and more technology is integrated in a way that builds producer capacity, they're going to just have more and more success with technologies that are economically feasible and enhance their production operation. And so is this a silver bullet? You know, are we, will precision tech solve the world's problems? You know, I'd say no, maybe not, you know. And there's an example. I was talking to somebody in the dairy world, and they're building a lameness model, and despite all the sensors, and supportive of the dairy industry, but just for example here, lameness is still a problem despite all the infrastructure and technologies. And so there's chronic problems, and we really need to evaluate how we can use these technologies to bring progress and avoid them causing more problems. And this really requires a systems approach, which we'll get into. But first, let's talk about, with these type of opportunities and challenges, what kind of people are we developing to implement these and help our current producers and future producers? And so there's things like, you know, we developed at A&M when I was there, a virtual cattle handling video game, because 70% of the students have never interacted with livestock or in animal science. And so another thing is young children, is programming going to be like learning Spanish or French in school, programming languages, computer programming, to learn how to build technologies. And there's all sorts of workshops and efforts for this. And then the next generation of animal scientists. So, you know, these are two of our grad students at the Cottonwood Field Station, and they're learning this technology and they're learning programming, but they need to talk to producers. They need to get this really practical aspect, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we can't discount years of experience, but we need to couple that with practical and reliable technologies to build students who can understand both and be that bridge for technology and producer implementation. And so going just a little bit further, longer term out, is, you know, there's a tremendous potential for workforce development. And so this is a whole new industry. We'll have these animal science students, we'll have small businesses that will be able to provide software, hardware, maintenance, animal science data specialists. There's even a company that Dr. Brennan talked to, that they said, we just want to be a hub. We just want to provide a data hub. And that's all we want to do for this precision tech. And so this can really revitalize our rural economies. And as we've seen with the COVID pandemic, we can work from anywhere pretty much if you're working from a computer. So that barrier to buying a $250,000 combine or a ranch, now there's opportunities through this precision roll to partner with ranchers and to get youth back into our rural economies and revitalize them. And so it's just a tremendous growing role for the new generation. We're really excited about it. And so now we've gone through this, just a recap, collecting the data, the gap, the models, implementing it, and we really want a systems level change. So it's not just animal performance, but we want our forages to produce more. We want our animals to respond better and be healthier. And so now we're going to go into, okay, systems, it's complex. So Emma Stevens outlined, traditional thinking process. There's a problem, we implement a solution, and we see what happens, versus this kind of interconnectedness, which is, okay, if I do something, there's feedback, and that feedback can be immediate or it can be over time. So this precision technology and all these things we've talked about are all interconnected in it. So it's not just return on investment, but it's production, and then it's animals, and it's cultural barriers of technology acceptance. So it's a messy problem or challenge. And so we can look at that in a couple ways. And just again, recapping what we've gone over, we have our producer here, and he's trying to balance right now forage quality and quantity and feeding my cattle and the animal classes to get a product down the supply chain for consumers to enjoy meat, if you love beef like we do. And so then that goes back to obviously economically and connects the loop. So one, we want to enhance animal production. We want to do that what we're calling an economically sustainable way of implementing this technology. So see here, it takes planning. You see all the Post-its that the rancher has. Time, not just labor time, but planning time to think about it. It takes money. So money for equipment, money for service, money to call the person to come help you set it up. And so then labor as well. And so once we actually get these technologies out, then we're need that next generation of animal science modelers, technicians that can help us to do our rotational grazing or adaptive multi-paddock grazing to increase forage quality and to better ecologically use our diverse forage resources and alter species composition in a way that's environmentally beneficial and for our cattle. And so this is the second biggest loop around that first loop. And so then we have our third loop, which is this kind of global or national picture. We have that Bad River landscape again. And so we want these things to be sustainable, to build things like soil health. We also need to consider, this is the Blair ranching family in Western South Dakota, and they have a really nice website and YouTube videos. And I'm just using them not for their product endorsement, for example. They just share about their production story. And so we really need to connect this production story of these technologies and sustainability of how great South Dakota example, for example, I'm biased because we're in the state, is stewarding the land. And that can add value to consumers who are driving this total meat production demand, red meat specifically for our case. And so that's that environmental and public synergies that we really want to capture. And so in conclusion, there's this, we want to optimize, or you hear those buzzwords, efficiency and decrease costs, but there is a tremendous opportunity for extensive systems. And we believe that real-time data can enhance individual, animal, and rangeland plant productivity and performance. But we need to make sure we're taking into account the feedbacks between these three loops that we talked about, of enhancing that production, doing it in a way that's going to build capacity, reinvigorate culture, reinvigorate rural economies, and then do that in a sustainable way, environmentally, publicly, economically. And so with that, we'd like to take any questions you might have.
Great, thank you very much. Several comments already in the chat about that is a fascinating talk and a lot of a lot of very interesting perspectives that you brought that many of us, I'm sure, hadn't thought about in this context. A question that relates to what you just talked about from Pat Schnabel, because initially in the introduction you talked about wanting to maximize performance per animal or on a per animal basis, but that doesn't necessarily maximize profit of the system, right? And so we really have to. Point is, we really have to look at it from the systems perspective in terms of both profit and sustainability. And he brings up the example of in maize. So the focus is on yield per acre rather than yield per plant. So yeah, and that's sort of the same here, right? You have to look at the system rather than the individual animal. You may need the individual animal data to get there, but it's the system that you want to focus on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's that perspective of pounds per animal or pounds per acre of beef. And so most of the grazing guys will go by pounds per acre of beef that they're able to raise for rotational or soil health guys.
And there's also this dynamic. Sometimes are you a livestock producer or are you a grass farmer?
Yeah.
And some of the things like in rangeland, we try and push people to think about, you're farming grass and what are ways can you improve that grass production, which is ultimately what gets turned into your beef.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a comment from Christine Jertain. I hope to pronounce that last name correctly. She's a high school teacher and a teacher coach with Nourish the Future organization. And she comments that she really would like to, talk to you guys about infusing this in some of the teaching that she does, the education that she does. So I'll let you follow up with her after the talk. But yeah, definitely a lot of interest.
And I'm aware of, one colleague that has an extension program where he's, bringing livestock GPS data into high school classrooms, teaching them how to, process and analyze data and map cattle and landscape. And I think, for certainly in range science, which is a lot of my background, is we kind of always had this challenge that forever we relied on bringing students in off the ranch, and haven't always done the best job of reaching out to other students that might be interested in range, but just aren't as aware or familiar with it. And we really think technology also might be a way to bring students into like animal science, into range science that maybe don't come from a traditional ag background. So I think certainly, I would love to speak with you more about what some opportunities are to be able to accomplish some of these.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Ernest?
Make a comment, question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things I've seen over the years, and it's been on the decline for probably at least the past 30 years, is we are seeing fewer and fewer forage agronomists and rangeland scientists coming out of the university systems. And to me, that is one of the most critical roles moving forward here as we try to manage our grazing systems better. I work in industry, and a lot of the people that we are getting out of our universities these days that are they're animal science focused, and they have barely ever stepped foot into a grassland. It's been, it's been feed and feedings course, and it's been feedlot oriented, cattle, showing cattle. I would argue with anybody that the greatest potential in livestock management right now is not in animal genetics. It's not in feed quality. It is in the management of our grasslands to optimize the production per acre and to provide those ecosystem services. That's the other thing. People think about increasing the carrying capacity of a farm and think we're just going to degrade the land more. And a lot of these well-managed systems, we see that we gain a lot in terms of ecosystem services, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, all of that kind of plays into that. But we're losing the people. We're not training enough people now that specialize in that relationship between the forage produced and the animal. And that's something we've got to fix.
I'll tell you what my advisor told me after my animal science degree. He said, he was a production agronomist. He said, Hector, animals are cute and cuddly, but they need to eat. And so that's actually the reason why I switched my MS to more agronomy focus.
Yeah, and that's that's an important focus of this initiative also, right? Is to integrate crop, forage, and livestock. And so, and I think really point out the need for that to accomplish that. We are at the end of our time, or a lot of time, but Nicole put in the Slack channel or the in the chat the Slack channel where we can continue these conversations. So please make use of that. And then there's also she put in a link in the chat for a survey that I hope all of you will be taking as you before you leave. Couple of other announcements. Next field day will be on the industry show. It will be an industry showcase, so where a couple of industries are going to showcase products that they have, not necessarily as an advertisement, but as opening the eyes to all of us what technology or other services are out there that could be useful for us in research. There is going to be a training workshop, which still has to be announced in October. The next round of seed grants applications are due in a couple of days. So hopefully several of you are working on those. If you have questions, feel free to contact us. And then also we have a call for proposals open on the industry collaborations, which will close October 1. And that's a field day. That will be for a field day that we are planning for November, where industry is asked to or invited to highlight collaborations that they have or that they want to establish, because an important focus of AG2PI is industry, academia collaborations, and we definitely want to give the industry an opportunity to highlight the collaborations that they already have or what collaborations they would like to have in this whole arena of agricultural genomes to phenomes research. So with that, I want to thank Hector and Jamie very much for a very fascinating talk. Like I said, it really has opened my eyes to what the challenges are, but also what the solutions are. And I think definitely the future is bright for improving these rangeland systems, and like we've discussed, getting lots of people interested in, lots of young people interested in working in this area and helping that along. So with that, I'm going to close the session, and once again, thanks for everybody for their participation. It was great discussion again, and really hope we can continue in some of this on the Slack channel. So with that, I'm going to close the session. Thank you.